you everyone for joining us on Thursday, September 17th for our Hanauma Bay Education Program, Hanauma Talks. Today we are featuring Christina Coppenrath from the Marine Turtle Biology and Assessment Program. And she'll be talking about sea turtles in the Main Hawaiian Islands, biology, research, and conservation. So without further ado, Christina.
Thank you. So as guys, my name is Christina Coppenrath, and I am working with the Marine Turtle Biology and Assessment Program, and that is in the Protected Species Division of the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the sea turtles that we have here in the Main Hawaiian Islands, a little bit about their basic biology, some of our research techniques that we use to study them, and then some conservation measures. So to start, I think it's pretty important to acknowledge all of the work that many different agencies and organizations have put into studying the sea turtles throughout the state of Hawaii. There are a lot of people involved, a lot of different organizations, and one very important thing to mention is that there's a lot of volunteer work that goes into sea turtle conservation. I don't think sea turtle conservation globally would be anywhere near where it is without a lot of volunteer effort. So, like I said, I'm in the Marine Turtle Biology and Assessment Program, or what we call MTBAP, at NOAA here in Honolulu. And although we do have research that our program conducts within the state of Hawaii, we also have a lot of different collaborative research projects throughout the Pacific Islands region. But today we are going to be focusing on right here in the middle, at the Main Hawaiian. And so a little bit about me. I grew up and went to college in San Diego, California, and that is the first place that I worked with sea turtles. And I didn't even know that we had sea turtles there until I was in college. And I then moved to Florida for graduate school, and I was lucky enough to be able to work with nesting green turtles, loggerheads, and leatherbacks. And I also had the opportunity to visit the Dominican Republic and work with some juvenile green turtles and hawksbill turtles. After graduating with my master's degree, I got lucky enough to be selected as a field camp research assistant with MTBAP to go up to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands to study the green turtles that are nesting up there. Now, this year, I was hired again to work as a field camp research assistant, but we did not end up there. And I have recently been hired on in a new role. And throughout my work with MTBAP, although I personally spent most of my time up in the Northwesterns at French Frigate Shoals, I've been lucky enough to learn a lot about sea turtles throughout Hawaii through all of the other people in our program. So, to start, a little bit of basic facts about sea turtles. Sea turtles are marine reptiles, and they spend the vast majority of their lives in the ocean at sea. They are air breathers, so they can't breathe underwater like a fish, but they can hold their breath for a really long time, about 2 hours. I know during nesting season in Florida, we would go diving, sleeping turtles on the reefs, and they just kind of hang out down there and take a nap. And whereas a lot of marine mammals are described in their diving physiology, I read a really interesting paper that talked about sea turtles as surfacers rather than divers, because they do spend pretty much all of their lives under the water except for nesting, except for when they have to come up to breathe. But they're eating underwater, they're swimming underwater. They are underwater creatures. And they have these really complex and vulnerable life histories. So they live pretty long lives, for what we know, about 80 to 100 years max. And it takes them a long time before they can become reproductively mature. And our best estimates are about 20 to 40 years. And so these two life history characteristics mean that if we were to have some sort of rapid population decline, if we were to start taking certain measures to try and increase the population again, because it does take about 20 to 40 years for them to start reproducing, there would be a pretty big lag before we'd start to see any real changes in our population that we would be able to notice. Another thing about sea turtles is that they have really high hatchling mortality. Our best estimates are that 1 in every 1,000 to 10,000 hatchlings actually survive to maturity. But when we think about sea turtle reproductive strategy, they lay a lot of eggs. So if an average green turtle here lays about 7 nests per season, and they have an average of about 100 eggs in a clutch, that means that they could produce up to 700 hatchlings if all of those eggs incubate successfully. And so if we had a few hundred females nesting last year at French Frigate Shoals, and each of those had 700 hatchlings, we would be swimming in turtles if all of those survived to adulthood. And so what we see in a lot of animals is that some animals will produce few offspring and they put a lot of care into those offspring, whereas others produce a lot of offspring. They put very little care into those offspring, but it's kind of a numbers game. Hopefully, if you produce a lot of babies, some of them will survive. And then another interesting life history characteristic about sea turtles is that they take these, or they can take these pretty long migrations, and this can be complicated for management. So what we'll kind of get into in a little bit is that, for example, a nesting population of leatherbacks in the Western Pacific, maybe in Indonesia, migrates all the way across the Pacific Ocean to foraging grounds off of California. And during that migration, they could be experiencing bycatch in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But if we're seeing changes in the nesting population in Indonesia, it could be related to that bycatch. It could mean that their food resources aren't very good, or it could have something to do with how many of those hatchlings are surviving and growing up to adulthood. And so when we have these really long migrations, it can be complicated for management, especially when there are multiple jurisdictions involved. So that makes sea turtle conservation sometimes a little bit complicated. Now, if we go through a basic life history of a sea turtle, after hatchlings emerge from their nests and go into the water, they embark on what we call the lost years, because very, very little is still known about it, but almost nothing was known about it until very recently. And hatchlings and then post-hatchlings will spend oftentimes in the open ocean, and they associate with floating algae and other types of flotsam, where they kind of hide until they grow big enough to escape the gape or the mouth of a lot of predators. So a lot of things want to eat little baby turtles. And so while they're associating with this flotsam out in the open ocean, they eat pretty much whatever they can. It's really opportunistic, and they have to play this kind of cost-benefit situation where they need to find food, but they also need to be able to hide, because they can be predated by birds from above or fish from below. So they're kind of trying to hide, but also hunt a little bit while they're out there. And then after a certain number of years, this is different depending on the species and population, they will recruit back to these nearshore feeding grounds or foraging habitats. With green turtles, we'll say probably a little bit like dinner plate size. And at this time, they start to change their diets. And the developmental foraging grounds that we'll see juveniles at are not necessarily the same ones that we see them foraging in as adults. But these foraging grounds are really important. Once they reach adulthood and they start reproducing, they will migrate to nesting grounds. And we call this natal homing. There is a lot of different research on how exactly it is that sea turtles find their way back to the general regions that they hatched from. But one of the main hypotheses is that they're able to detect something in the Earth's magnetic field after they emerge from their nests, and they're able to use that almost like a GPS to make their way back to the same areas that they hatched from for nesting. Now, with adult females, females do not typically migrate back to nesting beaches every single year. There's usually a couple years in between the reproductive cycle. And so what they need to do is they need to spend a few years feeding at these foraging grounds, getting real fat, saving up a lot of energy, because once they start migrating and start nesting, most of our research tells us that they are not feeding during that time. And I was able to participate in some really cool research in Florida where we actually measured fat depth across the nesting season of females, and we did see that actually the depth of their fat got a lot skinnier across the nesting season. So they really rely on those energy reserves. Now, we're not exactly sure how often the males return to the mating grounds. It's very possible that they return more often. There's some research going on right now to try and figure out what the sex ratios are of the adult breeding populations. And because right now, our best estimates are that most sea turtle populations are very female biased. And so we want to know how these populations can succeed. Are there going to be enough males to mate with? And one of the theories is that males might migrate to these reproductive areas more frequently. And then after the nesting season, these adults will migrate back to their feeding grounds and do it all over again. So how do we study these animals with these complicated life histories? Because for different parts of their lives, they're in different places. They spend a lot of time underwater. And so we have a variety of different research techniques to try and learn a little bit about these populations. And in Hawaii, we have kind of a more unique technique of giving turtles motos. And that is this kind of unique number and letter code that we will put on animals that we encounter. In the northwestern Hawaiian Islands at French Frigate Shoals, it's one of the best ways to kind of get a census and know that you have seen that turtle, because when we first arrive there, we'll see a ton of turtles, and we just want to make sure that first and foremost we get a count of how many animals there are there. And it also becomes very convenient when we have situations like this one, where on a normal basking survey, we would try and see every turtle, make sure it's tagged, make sure that we have all the data that we need for each individual, but sometimes that's not possible. So like in this photo, there's a little weaned pup here, and it's really important in the Northwestern to do not disturb any of the seals. So if we have turtles with motos on them, we're able to use binoculars and actually take a census of what turtles were present there at that time. Another very cool thing about motos is that they're visible from a little bit further away. So with some of our tags, you either have to get pretty close or you need a scanner to see them. And with motos, they're pretty big. And it allows also for some really cool citizen science. So one of the things that we love when people around Hawaii do is when you see a turtle with a moto, take a picture or record it with the time, the location, and you send that information to this email, respectwildlife@noaa.gov. And this turtle here in the middle has a moto LM6. This was actually just submitted to us in the past week. It was seen in Kaneohe Bay here on Oahu. And it was actually a male green turtle that we encountered last year at French Frigate Shoals on Little Gin Island. And my colleague Mary Lou gave this turtle its moto on June 20th. So it's pretty cool that this moto is still looking pretty good. One of the, I guess, downsides to the motos is that they don't have the biggest longevity. So they're usually good for about a year, although sometimes we will get some pretty good ones that stay on longer than that. Our other tagging techniques that we use are metal flipper tags, which you can see here on the left. And we attach these pretty high up in the hind flippers of the turtles. You can kind of see where it's at right here. And these all have unique number and letter codes as well. We also use what we call pit tags. which are essentially the same thing that you use to microchip your dog or your cat. One of the nice things about the metal flipper tags is that you can see right away that this animal is tagged. The numbers are pretty small, so in order to see the tag, you do have to get pretty close. But these generally don't stay on as long as a pit tag. Pit tags generally have a kind of longer retention in turtles, but if you're looking at a turtle, you don't really have an easy way to tell if that turtle is tagged or not. So we need a scanner to tell if these animals are tagged. But the reason why we give these animal tags is that we can start learning a lot about certain individuals once they are known animals. And so this past year we got pretty excited. We scanned a female on East Island at French Frigate Shoals, and we saw that she had been originally tagged, I believe with metal tags in the early 1970s. And so getting that kind of information about an animal, we were able to see in our database how many times we'd seen her nesting, what her nesting frequency was. But once we have a lot of animals tagged and we get these kind of histories on a lot of different individuals, we're able to get some really interesting population level information. And so that's why we have these different tagging techniques. Now, another very cool type of tag that we sometimes use is called a satellite tag. And basically, we attach a satellite tag to the shell of a turtle. And this turtle, or the tag, once the turtle comes up to the surface, will send a signal to a satellite, which then processes that, or will send that signal to a processing center. And we are basically able to get location information via email. And so when you see those maps that have all those little lines about where an animal went, this is the type of tag that we use for them. They're more expensive than the other tags, but they give us really valuable data. You can program them to collect more than just location data. Based on different types of tags that you can put on a lot of different animals, you can get temperature, depth profile, salinity, all sorts of stuff. And they give you a lot more real-time information about exactly where a turtle is and the route it takes, rather than with our other tagging techniques, you really just kind of get point A and point B information. And what's really exciting is we were actually just able to recover one of these from a turtle that was tagged earlier this year and migrated all the way to French Frigate Shoals and then came all the way back. These tags are a little bit limited in the size. So when we want to learn about a turtle's migrations, this is a great way to do it. And I know I mentioned the pelagic lost years of hatchlings, but we haven't been able to do that for a lot of populations just because of the size of a hatchling versus the size of a satellite tag. In the Atlantic, they were able to raise some juvenile green turtles and loggerheads for about 4 to 6 months until they're about the size of a little Nerf football. And they were able to get some really cool information about their post-hatchling migratory routes. And for places where we're able to give hatchlings a little bit of a head start, this might be an option. But in general, we pretty much limit most of our satellite tag use to these larger turtles. You can see the antenna sticking up right there. Now, one of the main questions that is hard to answer in sea turtle biology is how old a turtle is. It's pretty hard to age a sea turtle. You can't tell just by looking at it, and size does not mean the same thing as age, because for reptiles, their growth is really based on their resource availability and their, so if they're able to get a lot of food and good quality food, they'll grow bigger quicker. But if they're getting poorer quality food or they don't have access to as much, they won't grow as quickly. But we still collect a lot of size measurements because we're able to use this in conjunction with another technique that I'll mention in just a moment. But it also gives us good information about like what size turtles start nesting at. That gives us a good idea of size at maturity. The general sizes of animals, you can kind of start to guesstimate a little bit. And a really cool technique that is a little bit more recent is called Skeletal Chronology. And this is where we can use the rings in humerus bone, which is just our arm bone or the flipper bone in a turtle, to try and get a little bit of an idea of how old a turtle is. And so obviously this can only happen after the turtle is deceased. You can't take a humerus bone from a live turtle. And Sean Morikawa in our program is our Skeletal Chronology wizard. And she is able to, by knowing the size of the turtle and the date that it died, go back and look at where the other rings in the bone are and the size of the humerus bone at those other rings, because there's a correlation between the size of the turtle and the size of the bone. And by using that information, we're able to actually estimate the age of the turtle that we found. Then another research technique that we use to study sea turtle populations is nest inventories or excavations. And this gives us an idea of kind of what is the production of new turtles into the environment each year. And so we have to conduct these after the nests hatch. We typically do this about 3 days after we see hatchlings emerging from the nest. And things that we want to know is how many eggs were laid, how many eggs hatched, because not all of them hatch, not all of them are fertilized, not all of them develop totally all the way. And we evaluate the nest success, and we look at what factors might be playing a role in the patterns that we're seeing. Is it a really deep nest? Is it a really shallow nest? What type of substrate is it? So is it really rocky or is it really sandy? Is it shaded? Is there disturbance? There's all sorts of things that we take into account to try and figure out what's going on these beaches. And so by looking at that, we're able to start to have a little bit of a guesstimate of what the hatchling production is at that beach. So now that you know a little bit about some of our research techniques that we use to turtles here, let's talk a little bit about what turtles we have here. So there are 7 species of marine turtle found worldwide, and we have 5 of those here in Hawaii. We have the green turtle, the Hawksbill turtle, and then offshore we can see the loggerhead, olive Ridley, and leatherback turtle. But the ones that you will see near shore in Hawaiian waters that you are more likely to see if you are snorkeling or diving would be our green and Hawksbill turtles. So green turtles are the more abundant turtle. They're the turtle that you think of when you think of a Hawaii sea turtle. And in Hawaiian, its name is honu. And our Central North Pacific distinct population segment is listed as threatened. Now, Hawaiian green turtles do stay within the Hawaiian archipelago. So this distinct population segment is strictly for Hawaiian green turtles. And they are the largest of the hard-shelled turtles. So they can get up to 303 or 350. They get pretty chunky. Sea turtles, going out and finding a turtle in the ocean is relatively difficult. But when you have a bunch of females crawling up on the beach, basically coming to you to be studied, it's a lot easier. And as a result, there's a lot less known about males in most sea turtle populations. And so by having basking turtles here and having both sexes bask, it's a really cool opportunity to learn about male sea turtles. I know that was something that I was just blown away with when I saw all the males basking at French Frigate Shoals. I had maybe only seen a couple of male adult sea turtles ever in my life, and that was while diving. So to see all of them kind of crawled up, hauled out in the sand, hanging out, and we were able to collect a ton of data on them. That was just really, really cool. And so green turtles here will forage kind of throughout the whole archipelago. But they primarily nest at French Frigate Shoals in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. About 96% of the entire Hawaiian population goes there specifically to nest. But we do occasionally see nests in northern Molokai and in northern Oahu, a few each year. which brings me to some of the more exciting news that some of you may have seen recently. So over the past 5 years, volunteers with Malamana Honu, a nonprofit, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologists have been monitoring the nesting on Oahu. And what they've seen is that there were typically fewer than 10 sea turtle nests on the whole island. Now, this year we have seen upwards of 50. It is possible that there is a more kind of a greater survey effort this year, and it is possible that, especially with COVID, there might be reduced numbers of people on the beach, which a lot of kind of foot traffic can cause the tracks in the nests to be camouflaged. But I think it is important to note that we do not think at this point that the animals are nesting, the turtles are nesting here more because of the loss of nesting habitat at French Frigate following the hurricane in 2018, Hurricane Walaka. Because green turtles nest every 3 to 5 years on average, most likely the females that are nesting this year haven't been to French Frigate Shoals since Hurricane Walaka came through, so they wouldn't know that island had been lost. And it has reformed a little bit, although not to the extent that it was before that. So most likely, they also wouldn't migrate all the way there and then migrate all the way back before finding a suitable nesting place. There are other islets within the atoll that they could nest on, and so it's a little bit more likely that they would have found or at least looked for other suitable nesting habitat within the atoll. But we are really interested to see kind of how this continues in future years and see if we continue to have increased nesting here on Oahu. Now, the other very Hawaiian green turtle is the Hawaiian sea turtle is the Hawksbill Turtle, or honuʻea. And these are another species that you might see if you're very, very lucky while you're snorkeling in Hawaii. And they're pretty much characterized, you can see, by this pointy beak, hence the name Hawksbill. They've got a very narrow head, and they very specifically have these overlapping scutes, which are the scales on the sea turtle shell. And so that species name imbricata, imbricated means overlapping, kind of like roof shingles. And then also when they're small or smaller, they have these, what we call marginal scutes, the scales on the edge of the shell, kind of look serrated towards the back end. Now, our Hawaiian hawksbill population is listed as endangered. They are a smaller turtle than the green turtle. They only reach about 100 to 150 pounds. And they also don't mature until at least probably about 20 years. Now, we also consider hawksbills to be ecosystem engineers, but they are kind of engineering our coral reefs by eating sponges primarily, but we've also seen them kind of eat some inverts and algae, but you'll see them around. Watching them feed on the reefs is really interesting, so you'll see them really kind of get in somewhere and really go after something very specific. And we typically will see them at foraging grounds off of Big Island in Maui. And they primarily nest on Big Island. About 90% of the nests are on Big Island, but we also see some on Maui and Molokai. Now, the population of hawksbill turtles is significantly smaller than that of our green turtles. The population size is about 20 to 25 nesting females per year, whereas last year at French Frigate Shoals, I believe we gave just over 300 turtles motos. So just to put that into perspective. The other thing to note is that hawksbill turtles mostly stay within the main Hawaiian Islands. So these are a bunch of satellite tagged turtle tracks. And you can see that they've really stayed within the main islands, which is really interesting. The other fascinating thing about hawksbill turtles is how different their preferred nesting habitat is to that of green turtles. So green turtles, we see them in Hawaii at least nesting on kind of bigger sandy beaches, like very low-lying Although at French frigate, we do sometimes see them nesting in coral rubble as well. But with hawksbill turtles, we see them nesting on these kind of narrow, hard to access little beaches. And we often also see them nesting up against vegetation. And so studying the nesting turtles in Hawaii can be difficult. So with the green turtles, it takes a lot of time and effort and a lot of logistics to get the nesting team up to French frigate, which is very remote. You have to have everything with you. But once you're there, like, you are where the turtles are. And it's easy enough to encounter them. When I say easy, I mean with quotes. But with the hawksbill turtles, the ones that are nesting on Big Island, the people monitoring these beaches are hiking up and over lava to get to some of these really teeny tiny beaches and nesting areas where they may or may not see a hawksbill turtle, and they have to hike between multiple nesting beaches. So each population has some interesting challenges, definitely, to studying them. And then just to put that into perspective a little bit, when we look at our green turtle nesting and hawksbill nesting populations, the green turtle nesting monitoring started in the early 70s, and what we've seen is about a 3% annual increase in their population, whereas with hawksbills, it's stayed pretty low. And one thing to note is that we do not have a lot of historical data for hawksbill population numbers. It's possible that it's always been a small population. They might be resource limited. It might be that there's only a certain amount of really suitable coral reef habitat for them. And so that is something that we are continuing to monitor. But it will be interesting in years to come to see kind of if that changes. Another thing that we love for people to do, just like with our motoed turtles, is to report hawksbill sightings. So there's really, our estimate is about 1 hawksbill for every 100 green turtles. And so we have these posters that you may or may not have seen around, but we get really excited when people see hawksbills. It helps us understand where they are in Hawaii. And so we love when people report these sightings to us. And if you do ever report a sighting, whether it's a hawksbill turtle or a green turtle with a moto, there are some researchers here in Hawaii that have been doing facial recognition with the hawksbill turtles, and they're able to kind of identify individuals, which is really cool. And so when you email Respect Wildlife, we are able to give you a little bit about a turtle's history. And so you kind of get to learn a little bit about the turtle that you saw, which is exciting. Now in Hawaii, depending on the size of the turtle, it can be a little bit difficult to determine the species. So if you have a full-grown green turtle and a full-grown hawksbill turtle, you're going to know which is which, because the green turtle is going to be so significantly bigger than the hawksbill turtle. But if you do have maybe a smaller green turtle with a similar sized hawksbill turtle, sometimes they are easy to confuse. So there's a few features you can look for. One is these scales on their face in between their eyes. We call those their prefrontal scales. Hawksbills will have 4, and the green turtles have 2. And we also see that on their flippers, on the front end of their flippers, hawksbills will have 2 claws on each flipper, and green turtles will have 1. And then again, looking at the shell scales, the scutes. So if it's overlapping and you see some serrated edges, it's probably a hawksbill, although the serration kind of gets a little less pronounced as they get larger. Now, going into some of the other sea turtles that we do have in Hawaii waters, one of those is the olive Ridley turtle. And the nesting populations in the Pacific are in Mexico and in the Western Pacific. And this is also kind of a small species of sea turtle. And they eat primarily crustaceans, but might be a little bit opportunistic depending on what they're getting out in the ocean. And these turtles do occasionally interact with our longline fisheries. And what we can see is that if the Hawaiian archipelago is here in the middle of the screen, these dotted tracks are loggerheads. These solid lines are olive Ridley turtles. And so we will occasionally see them either throughout the archipelago or south of Hawaii. And these would be more migrating turtles out in the open ocean. But last year, actually, some very surprised tourists had some olive Ridley hatchlings emerge from under their beach towel in Kailua Beach. And they took photos and reported it, and our program was actually able to perform an excavation, and they found a couple of live hatchlings in the nest, which was exciting. They were able to release those. But occasionally we might see kind of a weird nesting event like this. This turtle was clearly nowhere near its regular nesting grounds, but it was an interesting encounter, that's for sure. We also occasionally offshore have loggerhead turtles, which are listed as endangered. And these get a little bit closer to green turtle size, about 250 pounds. And they feed primarily on hard-shelled animals like crustaceans and mollusks. And you can see this big old head, hence the name loggerhead. They can eat some hard-shelled creatures with those big old jaws. And these turtles actually nest in Japan. And for their kind of post-hatchling journey, they actually migrate all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Baja California, Mexico, which is their juvenile foraging habitat. Once they migrate back across as adults, they stay over in Japan. But while they're out in the open ocean, we will occasionally also have these interact with our longline fisheries. But you can see here with all these satellite tracks, if this is Hawaii, they're actually primarily migrating north of Hawaii. And lastly, the last turtle that we sometimes have in our water is the leatherback turtle, which are pretty cool. They're the biggest sea turtle. You can see these researchers outfitting one with a satellite tag. They get real big. I think the largest one ever recorded weighed about 2,000 pounds. And what's fascinating is that they only eat what we call gelatinous zooplankton, so all sorts of jelly type things. They are also these master migrators. So the ones that are nesting in the Western Pacific, Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, we're seeing some of these animals migrate clear across the Pacific Ocean to feeding grounds off of California, the Western US. And these are adult reproductive migrations. So the animals that you see feeding off of the Western US will swim back to the Western Pacific to nest and swim all the way back. They generally are pelagic or open ocean, but sometimes we will see them off of coastlines. All right, so if we start, so we've learned about the different species of turtle, and I wanted to mention a little bit about some of the threats to turtles that we have here in Hawaii. A lot of this information was given to me by Shandell Brunson, our stranding coordinator, and she coordinates all of the receipt of stranded dead turtles and even some live turtles, and kind of leads our charge to kind of figure out what caused the strandings. And so these are some of the major strandings that we see here in Hawaii, and I'll get into these a little bit more. So in recent years, actually, you can see in the red line here, this is green turtle strandings, is that hook and line associated fishing gear has actually surpassed FP, tumor-causing disease that you see in the black line. And that's now our leading cause of strandings for green turtles. And for hawksbill strandings, there are significantly fewer strandings that we have reported, but also fishing gear is the primary cause of stranding. So what we'll sometimes see is turtles that have either become entangled in or have ingested fishing line, and so that is the #1 cause of strandings for green turtles. And then gill nets and net associated strandings are the #3. So in general, fishing gear is a pretty big concern to us regarding strandings and sea turtles here in Hawaii. But another really problematic issue that we have with our green turtles here is this Fibropapillomatosis, and it's a disease associated with a couple different types of herpes virus, and it causes these tumors to grow primarily on soft tissues. And sometimes we'll see animals that are really mildly afflicted, but we will sometimes see really severe afflictions that absolutely restrict the animal's ability to feed or move. And what's tough is that we don't know exactly specifically what's causing it, but we do know that we see more of this disease when we see areas with higher nutrient runoff and pollution. And so kind of makes us think about the things that we're putting into the ocean. But I know there's a lot of research going on right now to look at specifically what causes this disease and how it's transmitted between individuals. We also see boat strikes occasionally. So this is really important to think about if you like boating, especially in areas where we like to spend a lot of time. For example, Kaneohe Bay is a great place to go boating and snorkeling and hang out, but turtles also really like it there, and it's not always the most clear of water. So there's some things that you can do, like wearing polarized sunglasses and just keeping your eye out, driving slowly, so that we can avoid seeing situations like this. Because if it's not always the propeller that can cause damage, sometimes if it's just the impact of the hull, that can cause a lot of internal damage. And then, of course, we have sharks. That's a natural predator of sea turtles, especially tiger sharks. This one on the left was actually a male that we saw at French Frigate Shoals last year. And this past week, we actually got a recorded sighting of this male with a lot more healed tissue here. And it was kind of cool to know that he was still alive and kicking. Another threat to our sea turtles globally is plastics. I'm sure many people have seen the video of pulling the straw out of the sea turtle's nose. I think this is a plastic fork. But it's also important to think about the microplastics. So this is a picture of all these little microplastics that were found in this deceased stranded post-hatchling's belly. And when we look at how the ocean currents circulate, any trash that's in the ocean is getting kind of swirled around in these garbage patches, and we'll see them all over the beaches within the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. But I know I've been on some beaches here on Oahu where I've seen a lot of microplastics throughout the sand. So something to think about when we try and see what we can do. And then the last threat that I'll talk about really briefly is climate change. So one of our primary concerns with climate change is how it's going to be affecting the sex ratios that we see within sea turtle populations. Unlike us, where we have chromosomes that tell us if we're going to become a male or a female, the sex of a turtle hatchling is going to be dependent on the incubation environment, primarily by its temperature. And in one of the labs I worked in, they said hot chicks will dudes. But basically what that means is that warmer temperatures create more females and cooler temperatures produce more males. And so some of the research that is being conducted within our program right now, we have a pretty rock star reproductive endocrinologist, Dr. Cameron Allen, who is trying to see kind of what are current sex ratios of our reproductive individuals, what are the sex ratios of the juvenile turtles that we're seeing off of Oahu in the Main Islands in general. And what we started working on last year up at French Frigate Shoals, and what we've been able to continue a little bit here on Oahu this year, is trying to investigate what the sex ratios are of hatchlings and how those might change. So this is a really important question globally. within sea turtle populations, because it's definitely concerning if we stop seeing males. So that may be a little bit of doom and gloom with all those threats that sea turtles face, but let's talk about how we can all help. So the first, I think most basic, first and foremost thing is that when you see a sea turtle, you've got to maintain that respectful viewing distance. Our kind of standard is a 10-foot distance between you and the turtle. So as much as you might want to touch a turtle, I don't know how many of you would want to stand on a turtle, or it's best to just say no to any of those. And I forgot to put it in my slide, but there is an app now. If you were to see something like this going on, you can report it to the Department of Land and Natural Resources, DLNR, and they have an app now called DLNR Tip, and you can report these violations. The other thing that you can do is report strandings. So we have a NOAA sea turtle stranding hotline, whether it's a live or deceased turtle. You can report these. Call the number, take photos, provide the time, date, location of the encounter, the approximate size of the turtle or the animal's condition. But the one thing we do ask you to do is not to, if it's still alive, not to follow it back in the water, not to try and rescue or detangle the turtle on your own. If it is basking and it is still alive, or it has hauled out and it's still alive, we don't want to scare it back into the water, because then we won't be able to go rescue it as easily. So we want to let it kind of rest and stay in the sand. But also, we don't want to put any of the public at risk. Sea turtles, you know, they don't look scary like some other maybe marine animals with big sharp teeth, but they can bite you. And their flippers are very strong, and they have claws, and they're very sharp. I know I have gotten a slice from a flipper. I think I have a friend who has a scar from one when you're trying to help an animal, but they don't know that you're trying to help. So it's best to just maintain your distance, call the stranding hotline, and they will send out the right people to handle that. I know we talked a lot about hook and line related strandings. It's really important to dispose of your used fishing line appropriately. So the photo on the left is from the Hawaii Marine Animal Response, which is our stranding kind of network here on Oahu that coordinates stranding response with us. And they just got a good grant to do a lot of marine debris cleanup and mitigation. And so they're going to be starting to put these up around Oahu. This one is from Maui Ocean Center. And these are a good way to dispose of your used fishing line. Even if you try to be responsible and throw it in the trash, unfortunately with the wind it can blow out, or a bird might pick it up. And we see fishing line all over the reefs, all over the beach. We've found it inside of nests, entangling hatchlings. And so this is a really easy way that you can help. It's really important. And then if you are fishing and you do catch a turtle, it's important to know that it's okay to help the turtle. The first thing we want you to do is to call the hotline and kind of report what has happened. But the other thing that you can do is you can reel in that turtle very carefully. You know, don't haul it up a cliff if you're fishing from a cliff. Hold the turtle by its shell, the kind of front right behind its neck, and then the end right by the tail. And you want to cut that line very close to the hook, and then attach it. But the biggest thing is to call that hotline first. You can't always choose what bites your hook, but it's important to know that we would prefer that you follow these steps and report it to us, rather than just cut the line with a bunch kind of left over that might end up entangling later on. Then the level. Know where you're from. So we have interaction with turtles and our fisheries, and it happens globally. Our fisheries here in Hawaii are some of the most well-managed fisheries in the world. And so just in general, being aware of where your food comes from. There's a couple of good apps or resources for you. One of the easiest ones I'd say to use is the Monterey Bay Aquarium app called Seafood Watch. and it will tell you all sorts of things about not only just the fish populations, but also like bycatch information. So just being aware and being responsible in your seafood choices is a big way to help. Before I finish up, I think I ran a little long. Don't miss out on next week's presentation. Irene Kelly with our regional office is going to talk about partnerships in sea turtle recovery at Pacific Waidohana, and a lot of the conservation measures that they have implemented throughout the Pacific Islands region. And with that,
thank you, Christina. Mahalo for your presentation. I apologize, Gavin was having technical difficulties, so I'll just ask to see if anyone of our viewers might have a question for Christina. Feel free to either type it in the chat or unmute yourself and you can ask a question. Okay, well, I had a question from Gavin.
okay.
So let's see. Gavin wanted to ask if you guys were able to tag any of the turtles that laid eggs at Bellows Beach, and if any of the turtles that laid eggs were previously tagged.
So we, NOAA employees or individuals were not able to do any sort of nighttime monitoring at Bellows, and I believe the majority of the monitoring that's going on is in the mornings and the evenings. So I don't think that any of the turtles that actually nested there were actually encountered, but Malamana Honu and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and we've been able to also get out there and do some excavations. One of the projects that we have now is involving collecting genetic samples from some of the nest contents, so whether it's unhatched embryos or deceased hatchlings or even live hatchlings, and with some of that genetic information, we might be able to get some sort of, I guess, basic genetic information about the females that nested there. We might be able to tell how many females nested there, but we weren't able to actually encounter any of the turtles themselves.
Okay. All right. So any other questions from our viewers? Well, I have a question myself.
Okay.
Wait, let's see. Cameron Allen asks, what is your favorite sea turtle species and why?
My favorite sea turtle species is the leatherback turtle. That's the species that I worked with during my master's degree. They're just kind of insane to see up close. They're so big. They're like this weird dinosaur. And they make these really funny kind of grunting sounds when they're laying their eggs. They're very lovable.
Awesome. Wondering, earlier on you kind of touched on turtle size and how there's a correlation to maybe the quality or amount of food resources that they might be able to get to. So I was wondering if you guys have been able to observe maybe any particular locations where turtle size is either smaller or larger than average.
I don't know the answer to that question, but it is a very good question. I will have to ask my colleagues within my program to see if they might know the answer to that.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Yeah, because I didn't realize, I hadn't heard that before. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so in general, I think a lot of reptiles kind of grow based on what they eat. They don't kind of like reach, and I guess also what they have to put energy towards. So I think when we start seeing them nest, they grow a little less because a lot more of their energy is going towards their reproduction.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's see, have any other questions from our viewers? You might just wrap it up for this evening. I appreciate that you gave a lot of different things for our viewers to be able to do some citizen science opportunities and contact information to report any strandings or violations. So we can share that out when we post the recording of this presentation on our YouTube. And of course, for our viewers, feel free to contact Christina at her email that she has on her screen, christina.coppenrath@noaa.gov. And we want to say mahalo, Christina, for presenting tonight, and for everyone for joining us this evening. So we'll see you guys next week. Mahalo.